Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Clifford Humphrey. Clifford is a friend. He served as one of the first faculty members of Thales College, and he has recently moved from Troy University in Alabama to become Executive Vice Chancellor of the college system in the Florida college system. Way back in April of 2023, Clifford wrote an interesting essay entitled The Ends of Mere Classical Schools, Which Way, Western Man, for the American Reformer. I read it and thought Clifford did a great job speaking into a current conversation that's happening in the classical education world. Today, I'm excited to welcome Clifford on the show. So great to see you, man.
Yes, great to be here where the best ideas win. Obviously, this is one of the best ideas, so let's win.
Let's do it. Well, I wonder if you could start with catching our listeners up on the debate, in part because this episode will air sometime in season 5, so it will be several months after your essay. So catch us up. Some names in particular that I know are part of this debate are Matthew Freeman, Jessica Wilson, Scott Yenner, Jeremy Tate, and your article fits somewhere in this string of, I think, 15 or so articles that are part of this conversation across First Things and the American Reformer and the American Conservative and the Classical Ed Review and Law and Liberty and perhaps 4 or 5 other different web journals. So what is the debate that's happening, and where does your article sit in the middle of all that?
Yeah, one that you didn't mention was there were three articles, I think, at the Ad Fontes Journal. So that's another place if people are looking for where to go. So I'll mention another one of those particularly. Yeah, this is a debate which I'm glad we're keeping it going because it's an important one, and I don't think it should go away. I think it's something that's important that we continue to kind of work through. So a few months ago, a mysterious figure named Matthew Freeman dropped an article in the American Conservative in which he made a few challenges to classical education, and he basically said out loud things that a lot of us have kind of been thinking for a while. Something I mentioned in my articles, I've always been kind of surprised at the high degree with which everyone agrees not to really talk about the disagreements in classical education. Specifically, in my article, talks about the differences between the two words classical and education. So I hope we can kind of parse those out in case people don't want to bother reading my article. But basically, it comes down to two different, broadly speaking, views on those two things. And there's a kind of a contradiction that's been kind of working through the classical ed movement as it has grown. And obviously, it has been growing for a while. I liken it to the American Revolution period in history. So there has been lots of agreement on who the enemy is. And so we can all get on board with the revolution for that. But when it comes to actually writing the Constitution and agreeing on, okay, here's what we're going to do going forward, now the knives come out and there's a lot of disagreement that arises, which is good and necessary for any kind of big movement to happen. So here we are at that stage. What do we do about it? So it's important to recognize that everyone has agreed, okay, the current trajectory there's something wrong with that. And we should have a label that means people who are against the current trajectory, let's call it classical. If you are against the current trajectory, welcome aboard. You're part of the classical ed movement, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. That's where we've been, which is really good. But now we're trying to bring some coherence to what is this movement and what are we going to agree on and disagree on moving forward. And there are thousands of schools that have this label classical. It's not like it's trademarked or anything. Anybody could start a school and call it classical. Mm-hmm. And again, that would just be a signal to potential parents and families, hey, we're doing things different from the trajectory that we've been on for the last several decades. So if you're on board with what we're doing as far as questioning the current model, welcome aboard. So the couple debates that started with this Matthew Freeman article really brought out the disagreements, particularly sort of what is the telos that we're after here? What's the goal of classical education? And that's a debate in itself, because a lot of people will say, well, classical education isn't really about creating a certain kind of student. It's more about pedagogical methods. And if you can use those methods for any aim, right? As long as you're using those methods, you're classical, right? So that's one of the disagreements. So maybe we can get into my article a little bit to kind of get into the substance of those two things.
Yeah, I think so. We'll get there here in just a second. I think I think that's a really important point that you bring out, because it's really easy for classical schools to focus on a pedagogy. I think in an earlier iteration of Thales Academy, we focused on doing Socratic seminars as what made us classical, and that was under the particular vision that leadership had at the time. But people on leadership shifted, and today we would still say it's really important to do Socratic seminar. That's essential to what we are as a school. But I think we would focus, we worked a bit more in the last few years to develop a particular mission statement as a faculty, that we exist to cultivate excellent people through the pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness. And today, I think our leadership would really be aligned and unified in saying that we use Socratic seminar to get to that end. The end is the mission. Socratic seminar is not itself the end. But that was a process that took us several years to go through, and it's never done. Depending on how leadership shifts in the coming years, we might have some further refining of even that mission that makes it more clear what we're trying to do. And it seems to me that something like that is happening on a large scale nationwide.
Yeah.
Just to add a
whether it's Charlotte Mason or whether it's Trivium, whatever, they're the same kind of thing, right? So if we can just move beyond the pedagogical methods and get to something deeper.
Well, and just to add a couple more details on that debate before we jump into your article, the really big questions then that drew multiple people out. Freeman came out sort of guns blazing and asked the question: Is the classic learning test participating in the very things that it was seemingly founded to oppose? Particularly with the question of diversity in reading lists, and that then brings up all the educators who are ready to fight for this text or that text and why. And really, a lot of those names I rattled off kind of fall into two camps. There are folks who would say we should read things because they are inherently excellent. And there are others who would say we should read things because they bring a different voice to the conversation that has been silenced or has been dismissed over the years. And we're achieving some other good by bringing more voices into the conversation of what is read. And really, the question I want to go to for your article. This really seems to kind of really be all about, what does a school understand excellence to be? What is the excellence that a school is trying to achieve? So Clifford, walk us through your argument about this idea of excellence, which I'm assuming that's the English translation of the Greek arete. What excellence are you considering, and what do you think that excellence entails?
Well, I prefer to kind of go through the two terms, right? Classical education. And I think the answer to your question is going to come out in that, because, the simple answer is every school is going to have some version of excellent, right? And it's going to enforce that through various means of beauty and ugliness and honor and shame and on all of that. So that has to be understood right off the bat. The two different, for example, the two different kinds of excellence that you were pointing out within this debate is, one form of excellence is the more liberal one. The excellent person is constantly open to new ideas, and is more interested in making sure that the debate is happening along certain rules. So we want freedom of speech, the kind of free marketplace of ideas, bar nothing, right? So you can bring in any voice that hasn't been heard yet. Let's bring them to the table. Let's consider. Let's talk. The other one says, no, we've answered the question, what is good, what is true, what is beautiful. We're not going to question those sources again. Now the task is, how can we pass that down to our children, right? So those are the two. So an excellent person is one who knows the tradition really well and is able to embody it and practice it in their life and pass it down to the next generation. Right, that's that form of excellence. The other one is a person who's always demonstrating a kind of politeness, a kind of a perpetual open-mindedness. That's a different kind of excellence. So, but I think that'll come out more. And so I when I wrote this article, I thought, let's just have a very modest goal here, which is just show the confusion that surrounds these two terms that we use all the time, classical and education. And I know that there's a spectrum here, but what I wanted to do is kind of just show the two poles for how people understand classical and the two poles for how people can understand education. And then I hope that when people see the two extremes, they'll be able to think a little bit more clearly. Okay, here's more where I lean, right? It doesn't mean you have to be all on one side or all the other, but you should know that a lot of people are trying to hold these two contradictory things together in their minds at once, and they're not really reconcilable. So,
Yeah,
so
maybe a good way to put that, make that contradiction clear. I've got two lines that I thought really conceptually framed that opposition. One, you wrote that education is a process of shaping students according to a mold that is revered as excellence. But the next paragraph, you had sort of the opposite view as education is a process of shaking free of molds for the articulation of self-expression. So it seems like education has to do with molds, but one side sees the student as maybe there is a mold, there is a model that we are trying to call students to resemble. The other side is sort of throwing off any kind of models. Is that a fair way to articulate it?
yeah. So if we want to start with the word education, yeah, the one mold would say, okay, here's the tradition that we're going to follow, that is our tradition, and it comes at we get it with literature, we get it with art, right? It comes in all of these different ways, and all of them try and reinforce architecture, for example. All is going to try and reinforce our understanding of excellence and beauty and truth as those things are made tangible to us in stories, in art, and other ways. The other form of education is suspect of all those things because it looks back at the tradition with suspicion to say, no, the people who were establishing the criteria were biased in certain ways, whether it was regard to sex or race or whatever. And therefore we should be suspicious of those. And what we should try and do is deconstruct in a way and see through their biases, and we should allow into the tradition people who were excluded or marginalized, right, to use these kind of pop terms now. But it looked at the tradition and it assumes it's suspect. So therefore the truly educated person is the one who can see through that to the biases, right? Which is a lot of which is where Freeman's article was saying, look, a lot of what people who adopt this view of education are doing is something extremely similar to the critical theorists on the left, who are teaching children in our public schools to see, whiteness as the problem, male patriarchy as the problem, right? An educated person is the person who's woke, who can see through those things. So Freeman was just saying, hello, it looks like we're doing the same kind of thing here. And what we're doing is we're jettisoning the older view, which was to say, no, we're holding up these people. We're not in the past as heroes, right? He reduces a lot of education to hero worship, which is to say these people in the past, whether they be fictional or historical, had embodied in some way, in some virtuous way, the ideals that we hold up. Look to those people, seek to become like them, whether that be saints, whether that be figures like Achilles, or famous lives of the Greeks and Romans, like I mentioned in the article with Plutarch. Hold these people up as paragons, seek to become like them. These things can't really be, you can't revere something that you're also suspicious of, right? You can try and be a scientist and say, well, I'm just going to learn a couple things from them, but I'm gonna be very suspicious of them. A human person doesn't really work that way, right? You can't think about how it would work with your parents, right? You can't say, well, I'm gonna try and take notes from what my parents say is good and right, but I'm going to be very suspect and distrust them at some basic level, right? It doesn't mean you're not thinking anymore, right? But when we're talking about young children and we're holding up images and people as heroes that people should look to, you can't really teach them at once to revere and to be suspicious of the same people. So.
No, I think that's really helpful. And it reminds me a lot of, I think this whole conversation is really interesting because both sides could be talking about the exact same set of curricula. And what we're really talking about is a mindset or an orientation that's coming. Or how do we treat that curriculum? How do we treat this set of knowledge that we've received from previous generations? It reminds me of C.S. Lewis's line in The Abolition of Man, where he talks about teaching as old birds, teaching young birds how to fly. There is a specific knowledge that really has to be almost experientially passed down. So for Lewis, the part he gets at this also in his essay on the reading of old books. I mean, part of reading older works is because you literally are learning to think like people who are different from you and different in time, but also united in human nature, and that you're learning how to be more human through your experience in those older books. But at the same time, your comments remind me of a famous line from Paul Reichauer, where he famously referred to Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx as the masters of suspicion, and that all three of those guys really thought this was, and depending on context, sometimes this insight is helpful. And there are times where all three of those guys thought that the real way to get to the heart of a thing is not to study it itself, but to peel the thing itself back and see the underlying, whether it's market forces or power dynamics or sexual desires that are all making up reality. And that for those three masters of suspicion, the real need is not to deeply study something, but rather to see through it, which to bring Lewis back in at the end of The Abolition of Man. I mean, he closes with that great line that to see through a thing is actually not to see it. And that seems to be the danger there. So it seems to me that what on this, if we're thinking about these two poles, on the one side, we have a pole that is really supporting an education that begins in wonder and receptivity of the past and willingly accepts some of the flaws of that past. I don't know anybody who wants an uncritical receptivity of the past, but we receive the past because that becomes our foundation for learning, versus another pole that really that starts in skepticism. And that skepticism prevents a reception of the past, so that instead we're always stuck with critiquing and investigating and trying to pick it apart. And yet we somehow lose the ability if you start there, you lose the picture of the whole that would enable some sort of reassembly project. And that these become those opposite views of how do we approach a traditional curriculum.
Yeah. You and I have been around classical education for a long time. There are a lot of these sayings that are kind of thrown around, and I think it's important to kind of realize that some of the things we take unquestionably actually are contradictory with what we're trying to do. So one I mentioned in the article that I hear all the time is that classical education teaches someone how to think, not what to think. Now on the surface, that sounds great, right? But what does that mean? That means it to use a different way of saying it is to say we teach people how to see through things, not to see the things in themselves, right? So it's actually it's that other view of education, which is an extremely modern view. The other way of helping kind of reveal this thing is looking at the way we look at the term liberal education. A lot of people think that the term liberal there means freeing, right? That a kind of a liberal education frees your mind and opens you up in all of these ways that frees you from the biases and the prejudices. And there's something true to both of these sayings, right? But I think that we're at risk of adopting certain assumptions that we don't want, right? So the old view of what liberal education meant was that it was an education that was proper for a free man, someone who had the leisure not to have to work, to be able to study things that are not strictly utilitarian, that are good for their own sake, but that are also part of a tradition that goes along with the older view of education. So in the classical world, I'm just saying, look, you can't have both of these views. Ultimately, you should pick one. You should understand the contradictions, pick one, and build a school around that view instead of trying to include both of these things. So the title of the article, The Ends of Mere Classical Education, that's kind of a playoff of Lewis's Mere Christianity. But I'd written another article for Ed Fontes a couple years ago talking about the point of mere Christianity is to convince people to come to accept the basic tenets of Christianity. But then Lewis says you've got to pick a room. You've got to dig deep. You've got to commit to a stricter understanding, a tighter definition of what these larger ideas bring you toward. And what I'm saying now is maybe the classical education movement is at a state now where we're going to have to get a little more tribal and say, okay, we can all agree on certain broad things, but in order to achieve the education that we all want, we're going to have to dig deeper into our particular definition of what these ideas are. And then I could imagine certain schools that are saying we're more of this type, we're more of that type, but that we can get away from these contradictory ideas and really bring a little clarity. So that's what I was hoping to do.
So maybe just to offer some caricatures to fit that. Does that mean you would? So, I mean, I can imagine a high school that's founded sort of on a St. John's University model that adapted to high school, but doesn't really make any claim to political conservatism or cultural or social conservatism, but just says, we are going to read great books from a diverse set of backgrounds, and that's really our core. And we're more emphasizing the skills of reading, of writing, and of discussion. And the subject matter for that is going to really reflect these 5 or 6 kinds of diversity that we've identified as a school. And we've then built a book list from that. And if I'm understanding you correctly, you would still say they can call themselves classical, and that's a legitimate thing. At the same time, you could have another school that maybe identifies maybe they're working from something more like John Senior's list of 1,000 good books and 100 great books, or selections from Mortimer Adler's great books with a few additions based on certain criteria or whatever. And that kind of school ostensibly says, no, we are aspiring to produce statesmen like Winston Churchill and James Madison, whatever their ideals are. And we believe since Winston Churchill and James Madison read these 60 books in their equivalent of high school career, all of our students will read these 60 books. And if we can do more than that, we will. But we are definitely going to get all these kids through these 60 books. And that school, too, could call themselves classical and maybe aligns with something that's closer to a social, cultural conservatism that's more leadership-minded, that says, we want our students to have high aspirations for cultural significance in their future. And we want them to bend society in this direction. And that school too could call itself classical. Are those caricatures correct applications of what you're describing?
Yeah. So let's then go to the second word that I try and flesh out here, which you've already kind of provided a good segue for. So classical, what does that mean? Right. I think in the way we use the term, it can mean simply old. Whatever's old is classical. And in that sense, the more the merrier. If it's an old book, let's use it. Doesn't matter doesn't matter where it comes from. Doesn't matter if it's good by some other standard. If it's old, let's include it in the canon. And who are we to say whether or not it belongs or not? If it's old, it belongs. A second understanding of classical, which I think is the older view, is one that's one that's determined to be excellent by a class of people who have said this is objectively good, and we're going to adopt it as formative for our culture. You see the word. I mean, I kind of like etymology. I dig into the word. The etymology of the word classical literally meant something that was pertaining to a higher class of people, right? So the aristocracy of a civilization would say, this is what's good, and this is what's going to form our people. It can mean something like belonging to the highest class, approved as a model. And in that sense, I also was digging into the term ruler, right? So we think of a ruler as someone who rules, right? Who governs. But it's actually the same word for when you think of like a measuring stick, right? A ruler, a standard is the thing by which we measure ourselves, right? And when we're talking about education, we're holding the ruler, the measuring stick, up to children and saying, come and meet the measure, come and achieve the standard, right? that's very different from saying everyone is special and a butterfly, and wherever you are and whatever you become, education is about discovering who you are. There's no objective standard except to allow for everyone else to achieve their own self-actualization and authenticity, right? Very, very different kinds of approaches. So underneath this debate is one that's kind of dealing with egalitarianism and democracy versus aristocracy, something that America has always struggled with. And Alexis Tocqueville's really good at kind of pointing out, some problems there and some benefits that we have in our regime. But that's Americans are so uncomfortable with something that would say that would lead to some sort of inequality, right? Which is, if there's a standard of excellence, then that means that some people are going to fall short, and we don't like that. We want to give participation trophies to everyone and say that everyone's equal. And so part of this debate of what makes it so contentious is that there's really uncomfortable conclusions that draw from this, right? Which we're not comfortable with. So how do we reconcile those two understandings of classical? I think in the classical school movement, maybe you, like you said, you could have a classical school that says, hey, we're not going to have a standard here. We're just going to, if it's old, we're just going to expose it to our children, and we hope that they will be inspired by it and they'll do some self-reflection and understand greater about who they are, and then whoever they want to be it's up to them. That's one understanding, perhaps, of classical. And the other would say, no, we're gonna infuse a kind of virtue ethic into our whole curriculum, and the education doesn't just start and stop at the bell. It continues in the hallways and in the lunchroom. That was the school that I got to teach at for a few years, and it was understanding that teachers are never off the clock when it comes to demonstrating and being a part of that, of the enforcement of that measure and that standard. We're supposed to live it and teach it and show it to our students all the time. And that cannot, the standard for what that is cannot be perpetually up for debate. Otherwise, you'll never have a standard. You can't really pass anything down if it's liquid. So people have got to come to an understanding of what they mean by education. What's the purpose of it? Is it to pass down an inheritance, or is it to open people up perpetually to see through the biases and get to some sort of authentic way of expression? Same with classical. Is it just merely what's old, or is it some standard of excellence that we're going to try and embody in our curriculum?
And all great questions. I think as you're describing that, you're reminding me of the tension I felt when I was reading Matthew Freeman's 2 articles. Because in each of his articles, I found myself agreeing with parts of his argument, but then recoiling from other sections. The point I'm thinking of particularly in his second article, he focuses very strongly on the principle of hierarchy. And I think you're doing the same thing here, which I would agree that there is a great amount of our curriculum that is set in that sense, that it really is the subjects, the knowledges that have been most widely over the centuries approved as of value for young adults to enter into adulthood. My difficulty with that is, I guess, twofold. I want to complicate the hierarchy there, because certainly in America today, I have zero interest in just looking at our current elites and saying, could you please tell me what the good is? That is not the group that I want to say is the highest class in American life today. Instead, I want to appeal to Chesterton and his concept of the democracy of the dead, and that there is something to, Chesterton called himself a Democrat, but only a Democrat if you were willing to look at the past 2,000 to 4,000 years of Western civilization as a running group of people to be consulted before we make such choices. And in that sort of democracy, there are works that stand the test of time and are widely approved as having lasting value. So I think that the time element is key there for determining what is the class that then determines what is a classical curriculum to be taught at a classical school. It's got to be something that extends across time, and it can't be what I suspect a typical listener is going to immediately assume, that you mean class in terms of wealthy, middle, and poor. Like, we're not talking about economic class. We're talking about something closer to the ancient Greek ariste, the good, the best people but defining the best in that broader sense of time, not a particular location in place or a singular civilization. The other piece I would want to add to that is, again, to bring in another Lewis piece from Abolition of Man, is the idea of every generation curating the tradition, and that the tradition sort of gets refined and purified. And there are things that, and this too was a tension point for me with Freeman, because he seemed to appeal for a classical education that was taking us all the way back directly to ancient Greece and repeating some of the pieces from ancient Greece. But we are blessed to live on this side of the cross, and Christianity changes an enormous amount of things from ancient Greece. We've also learned a lot of things that are true that the ancient Greeks thought were wrong, and vice versa. So there's a sense of curation of knowledge over time that I think comes into view with that. Last thing I want to ask you about, Clifford, and we'll need to start.
You want me to respond to all three of these? Okay,
Oh,
I can remember these. Okay,
I'm watching our time, but go ahead. Go ahead. What are
okay.
your we'll wrap to it.
Okay, so the first one on what do I mean by class? What did Freeman mean by class? Right. Historically, it meant the leisured class, the aristocracy, the rich folks, right? The people who had leisure to study the things that everybody else didn't have time to study. It just happened to be that way, right? Jefferson and Adams, in their correspondence, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, talk about the need for a natural aristoi, and that's the ideal. That's what we want. You call it a meritocracy, but the idea that people who have unusual talents and ambition and virtue are able to rise. That's what we want. People to be able to come from anywhere, right, and be able to speak authoritatively to the rest of us, right. That's what we want. But we have to recognize that historically, that's not going to be possible with a class, except with a class of people who have the leisure to do that. So to look back and say, well, the rich people were mean and evil, and they were determining what was for everyone else just because they were rich, that's just not fair, I don't think, and that's not a really smart way of looking at things. If you're just considering that most women had to be pregnant like 12 times in their life in order to bring 2 adult people into the world, women are not going to have the kind of opportunity. Historically speaking, just necessity. It requires technology in order to overcome that. It's no fault of the past, right? Same with people who have the means to be able to have leisure. If you're working all day, you're not going to have the time to accumulate to read all of it. That's not their fault. That's not an evil thing. That's just a historical necessity. So the idea is, how can we bring about a natural aristocracy? That's the goal. That's really difficult. Let's try and do that, but that's really hard. The second point you were making, remind me real quick, was
is that Democracy of the Dead and Chesterton?
Yeah.
Which one did you want to go to?
We could do the Democracy of the Dead. So that's part of the first one, right? It's like, when we're talking about the natural aristocracy, we want to expose them to the Democracy of the Dead, right? We want them to expose them to the long, read as much as you can, right? But don't just read anything, right? You've got to have something that guides your thinking. Otherwise, you'll end up reading encyclopedias the rest of your life, and right, there's things that are objectively better than other things. And the second thing is the political necessity, right? There's always going to be a need for the current regime to try to perpetuate itself into the next generation. So right now, public school, right, is very much infused with the pieties of the current regime, which is why the classical school movement is a political movement. People are not comfortable with that. I mean, no, we just want to read books. I'm sorry, you're doing a political act. You just have to be honest about that. And that means that there's a kind of revolutionary element to this as well. So the next point you made was
curation, and each generation curating the past.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, each generation is not going to be able to start from scratch and say, okay, what should we include in our education? It just doesn't work that way. It's like Jefferson wanting to, like, maybe we should rewrite the Constitution every 19 years. That's a bad idea. You should start with the assumption that the received tradition is more or less good. Give it the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's a Chesterton posture, right? Give the benefit of the doubt to the past. Don't take down the fence, right? Unless you know why the fence is there to begin with. So that's that's a posture of reverence. And this goes along with the hero worship thing, right? Assume that the people in the past who you were told were great, assume that they really were great and that they were merited that greatness. Don't assume that they were, corrupt in some way, and that we have to sort of see through that.
I mean, the only pushback I would give on that, I guess, was twofold. I mean, I don't really want to. I think all humans are pretty fallen, so I'm not going to assume an unfallen greatness to really anybody. So I'm not surprised when my heroes have clay feet, and that too is I mean, I think that's one of the biggest benefits of a good historical training is that you start to realize, oh well, this culture might have some heinous thing, but so does everybody. Like everybody has some heinous thing. One of the things I had particularly in mind there about like the way the classical tradition changes. I mean, oh my goodness, the lot of women in the ancient world was awful. That changes with Christianity because Christianity gives an equal dignity of all humans are made in the divine image, and it takes centuries for that to work out. The other place, I mean, the other piece that I like in the article I wrote in this conversation, like literally nobody talked about my favorite sentence. I was really excited about the sentence, so I'm going to add it into this one. That in Socrates' day, one of the common methods of teaching was for teachers to sleep with their students. That is universally illegal and awful today. That is a change. So if we're going to try to and part of what Freeman at least seems to say, I don't know if he's actually saying this, but this is the implication of the second article, is a really is an unqualified acceptance of the classical world. And I think that's where that, for me at least, that's a bridge too far. I want to love the Greeks and love the Romans. I want to filter both of those through Christianity and through the course of the past 2,500 years, because I don't live in the world of the Roman Republic. I live in the 21st century, and there have been a lot of things that have been figured out. I appreciate air conditioning and germ theory, and I do like the fact that my car enables me to live 35 miles from where I work. Like all of those are things that are just that have to be grappled with. And so if we're going to talk about a truly classical education in the modern world, I don't think we could ignore all of that. So that's
absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Yeah. Freeman is he at least his second article did not have the kind of framing that enabled that sort of like, well, we're going to take this and we're going to pair it with what's happened since Achilles. Like,
yeah. Well, I didn't know we were going to go to pederasty, but interesting that you wanted to bring that up.
Well, it's always a complicating thing when you're like it's
well, no, right? It's weird. We look that's a good example of like something from the classical world that we look at. And we can't really wrap our minds around it yet. We probably never will. But so I don't know. I'm not sure what Freeman was thinking. What I suspect though is that he was using a sort of rhetorical argument, which you can understand as a debate coach, Josh. That he's painting over some flaws, and he's exaggerating a little bit because he's trying to kind of overcorrect some to try and reveal something about the debate, right? That he's offending in certain ways, right? Because he knows that the pieties are so strong in the other direction that I think he's trying to course correct. So a book I'm reading right now is Thomas Carlyle's On Heroes and Hero Worship, which is a sort of a classic look. Now, he was a Calvinist Christian, right? And his opening chapter glorifies Odin. But he's saying, look, there's probably something to the historical person, Odin, who became so compellingly excellent to the people around him that they couldn't help but want to follow him and revere him, even into generations afterward, to the point where he became a mythical legend. And so, yes, I mean, again, Carlyle's a Calvinist, right? He would say Odin, the original person, was a fallen human being, totally corrupt. We all are. And yet, it's still possible for humans to differentiate themselves through their choices and habits to become better exemplars of the human person. We think of this in the Christian tradition with saints, right? We hold up certain people as they look to that person. They did a better job of doing this life as a human being, as a fallen human being, than other people. Look to them. And Carlyle points to Christ and reveres him a lot and says, I'm not, I can't even name the person who's we hold up as the highest archetype. So there's something about the divine and mixing with the human, right, in a way that we find awe-inspiring, and we see it in various forms, right? But Christ would be the preeminent one. So the idea that the classical world has to be filtered through Christianity, I don't see that as much of a problem, I guess, as perhaps you do. I think we can still take the basic idea, right, that there are certain human beings that we can hold up as exemplars, again, as rulers, as the rule that we measure ourselves by. Doesn't mean that we see them as flawless, but we still can use them as helpful examples for us to model our own lives on.
Well, I mean, we're gonna have to draw this to a close. I promised my boss I would give her her office back in probably about 10 minutes or so. The only thing there's a lot we could do. We could do a whole separate episode on that question and whether or not the figures of the past, literary or historical or mythical, exist as exemplars or for something different. The only thing I'll say there is that I don't know Thomas Carlyle terribly well. I've read a little bit of his work on the French Revolution. That's all I've read from him. So I don't know if this fits the book you're describing or not, but I would be very uncomfortable with anybody holding up Jesus as an exemplar to say this is the archetype that you should follow, because I think Christ demands something completely other. He demands nothing less than to be absolute king over all of creation. And I'm not trying to become Jesus exactly. It's more like my submission to Christ, it fills me with him. But it's not that I could just like look at Jesus as the example and then do what Jesus did and be like Jesus. This is why the what would Jesus do bracelets, those things derived from a Unitarian minister named Charles Sheldon, who was definitively a heretic. I mean, he upheld that a similar idea, I think, to what you're describing of just like, take Jesus as the highest picture of what a human should be and then be like that. That's literally impossible. No one can do that. So we might also mean different things by exemplar, but that's something that we could get at in a future conversation. I want to wrap all this back around to one last quotation I want to ask you to speak on from your article. I think this has been a really fun conversation, that hopefully is helpful to folks in the classical education space who are trying to figure out what should their schools all be about. You wrote this line that I thought was just really interesting, because I think in one sense, there's a sense in which you clearly mean something by the word excellence, but the word itself it's called spacious enough that each school could define it as that school sees fit. And I think that excellence becomes sort of that idea of the ruler, where excellence is the rule by which we use to measure what we do and are we accomplishing our goal. So you wrote this line: excellence as virtue is the standard that cuts through race and sex. What did you mean by this, and how can excellence be sort of a North Star for classical schools?
Yeah. So on one level, excellence is going to be what it looks like is going to differ. It's going to be particularized. So an article I wanted to point to that was at the Davenant Institute by a guy, I forget his Chinese name. His Chinese, but he's on Twitter as Chinglican. He's an Anglican, Chinese Anglican guy, really thoughtful. And he talks about the need for classical education to be centered in a certain civilization. And so he says, for example, if I were going to do a classical school in China, I would hold up very different figures and as pointing toward the way that I would in America or in a European-based civilization, right? You have to particularize it, and that's very different from this idea of universalizing it, right? Which is to say, we should read everything, from Middle East and Asian and Indian and all of the classical literature from every civilization, and we should make our students into globalists, right? That's a very different version from saying, no, you're living in this place, and this is your heritage, and you should seek to become what these people have always thought to be excellent, right? So on one level, it's particularized. On the other level, excellence, I think, is a universal human thing, right? There are certain virtues that cut across time and space and race and sex, right? So men and women are going to look, courage is going to look different in men and women on one level, but it's still at its nature a very similar kind of thing. It involves fear and involves cowardice and rashness and knowing how to use prudential decisions in regard to those things. So, but I think being able to think clearly about those two things, right, whether the particular nature and the universal nature of virtue, leads to a clearer understanding that people who are of a different race and sex than I can embody those virtues in a way that I can perceive as excellent and want to emulate it myself.
Excellent. Well, fantastic. I know we can.
Excellent. Thank you. Excellent. See,
you found it. We got there. Okay. And let's see. I'm trying to decide if I want to ask any of my last questions. Nope. I'm going to wrap this up with Clifford. Where can people find and follow your work online? If they are intrigued by our conversation, how can they see more of what you do?
I post most everything that I write on my Twitter handle, which is at CP Humphrey. At CP Humphrey. I write a lot at American Reformer. I've written at Ad Fontes, The American Mind most recently. Something I've been interested in is this question of leadership, and I've written a couple things about it there. But you can find it on Twitter. So if you want to follow my most excellent thoughts, my ideas that win, follow me on Twitter.
Excellent. Hopefully all of our listeners will find you on Twitter. And just maybe this show will be so big that they will make you trending for just a little while.
Absolutely. And I should say, if you're watching this on the YouTubes, I wrote the name Winston down here because it's a shout out to our good friend Winston Brady. So my name is actually Clifford Humphrey, but
just in case you managed to fool anybody, it's fantastic. Well, Clifford, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. This has been really fun.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Clifford Humphrey, author and academic administrator working to rebuild American higher education. If you like this episode, please do leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.